Hello everyone, today we talk about the expansion of urban surfaces in the Italian communal era. This topic is of course connected with all the videos we made about the Italian communes that by now we have realized being one of the most important chapters in medieval history, but not having been adequately covered. And one of the, if anything, like the most important indicators for stressing the relevance of these communities is the sheer size of these city-states. We have actually made different videos even on this topic already, and or just talking mostly about the Italian cities during the medieval era when covering more or less the European landscape, given that indeed this demic urban concentrations were the highest in central northern Italy, and represented in fact like that flower of the communal civilization that we know from the great works of the Italian Trecento, of Dante, of the great Italian hosts, like the Italian communal armies that we have also begun to unveil a little bit from this abyss of ignorance that in a sort of more individual and constitutive way has unfortunately struck this topic. The theme we discussed today, of course, is deeply intertwined with more sort of social and also material engineering, archaeological aspects, but it's exactly the reflection of this power. Recently, for example, in our last video about medieval siege warfare, we observed how tricky the historiographical attention towards certain topics can go, right? Especially if you conceive medieval Europe as mostly or almost uniquely some sort of feudal rural context where settlements were small and sparse. It's without having in fact addressed this page of European history will be particularly difficult to picture what this all is about, right? I must say, most stereotypically, there are objectively videos on YouTube discussing especially the so-called Italian communal skyscrapers. I mean, the fact that the skyline of these settlements was basically covered by innumerable house towers that, together with, in fact, mostly these medieval buildings, are today no more. And so we have sometimes the idea, this is valid also for other places in Europe, right? Either modernity or destruction during wars has somehow demolished a great part of cities that were fully and powerfully and potently medieval in their outlook, in their output, right? And that really has erased as a consequence this general sense that there was a world like that. How many movies do you know that are actually set, for example, in the Italy of Dante, for example? Those would be, say, if you evaluate the general dynamism, politically, militarily, socially, or any other indicator, would be one of the single most important chapters in the medieval history, but somehow, right, we have plenty of videos on sort of an abstraction of a particular kind of feudalism, sometimes the Vikings, but sort of this dramatic concentration of force, like it gets basically forgotten. In part, again, it's also due to this lack of vision, right? What, for example, we connect medieval Europe to in general in the collective imaginary, it's mostly Central Europe. Why? Because great parts of Central Europe, even up to relatively short time ago, weren't properly hit by industrialization, by a massive sort of development that would alter even its landscape and the shape of settlements or their size, right? And this is true also the more you go east, except in the east, and this is true also for to an extent of some of these regions that what mostly we see as medieval, also in a stereotypical way when you have reenactors going to castles. These are not actually medieval things, they're early modern ones, actually modeled after the military engineering of countries, like, for example, the same Italy with the Tres Italien in the 16th century, with the star forts, were also demolished in Western Europe further, while certain countries more or less remained with those up to recent times, from, I don't know, the collapse of other powers like the Polish-Lithuanian one that reached its heyday exactly in the Renaissance at Similia. So we are brought to immediately connect a specific image, a specific landscape to an idea of the past, right? I think the best example is Rome, that we will partly discuss today. I was just making, I think, the other day the same exact example. That is to say, if you walk along the Imperial Fora road, right, so the one made during fascism, you have this very wide and monumental road that, of course, was designed also to show a bit the Imperial Fora in all their sort of openness, and not hidden by buildings and so on. And if you look at, like, going towards the Colosseum, if you look at on the left, there are some, of course, there are the Fora, but then there are some massive medieval buildings, including the so-called militia towers, and another one ahead, closer to the Colosseum, that is even bigger. You know how bulky and massive the militia towers actually is. There is another structure that only which the basis remains, however, is pretty tall. It's a multi-story building in comparison that gives you a dimension of. And the interesting thing is that there is nothing really of the same size there from ancient times, right? In those side of the Forum. I mean, you literally have the medieval towers that were typically there in Rome during exactly this period, the 13th and 14th century. Is literally the biggest building out there, fully built, not even sort of reused on the base of some other building. Of course, well, in Rome, at the foundations, at least something would have been re-exploited. But in general, like, and nobody cares. Like, nobody gives even a name to that, right? It's as if, okay, well, I'm there to visit the Fora, but what is this literally huge tower that I see here? Never mind. The militia towers, if anything, it's more famous because it's next to the Trajan Forum. There is the Hospitalier House, and so it's a famous corner of that part of the Fora. But if you go ahead, you find again this more anonymous buildings that are even bigger, and that nobody really cares about. Well, you have to imagine that Rome, aside from what you know better from antiquity and the Renaissance, mostly when the city was really remolded in a fantastic way, you can see, was also massive, and especially massively fortified, like practically all the other centers, city that was entirely covered in such fortifications. Like, it wasn't even, again, the idea of the skyline of the more typical, I don't know, middle-sized or even smaller-sized Tuscan commune, that is in fact like, I don't know, San Gimignano, Volterra, etc., that are the ones that in fact preserve themselves the most, as they were in the Middle Ages. There are many Umbrian communes as well that are the same. If you look at Florence, for example, it was also the other big metropolis there, the biggest center in Tuscany, one of the largest cities in Europe, as we will see now. Well, yes, there is a lot of medieval stuff, but it's sort of not like it actually was in medieval times in terms of fortifications. All around, this is the city rings. This is exactly what we're talking about today. We could talk about the house towers. We could talk also about the castles in the countryside. Actually, here I inserted some pictures from the same Monteriggioni, for example. That is one of the first military architectures properly created in a strategic fashion as military settlements. In that case, in the Tuscan hills, by Florence, right, to counter Siena. Again, we made multiple videos, both cities, and also about the Battle of Monteferti, so you have plenty of stuff to watch there. But pick Milan even. Milan was, together with Paris, was the biggest city in Europe. Medieval times was possibly even bigger than Paris itself. Hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, one hell of a city that we described also through the writings of Bonvesin de la Riva, this monk that we used especially to count the armories that Milan had at the time, as at that point, since the 12th century, the most important arms and arm production center in the continent. That was a massively medieval city, but aside from some parts of the older walls, and yes, you find late medieval stuff such as the Sforza Castle, etc., but you can see Milan in a real way. Even the cathedral is, as built over the centuries. It's not strictly what you would have seen at the time. And with all the alleys, with all the sort of more modern building, you can't recognize a medieval Milan. Venice may be a bit more like that, but in Siena is a lot as well. There are, again, many different sites everywhere. If you look at Pisa, if you look at Verona, of course you can, especially the Umbrian, these smaller cities, really. And I stress cities because these are not just towns. They are all city-states by the peak of medieval civilization. And so they had all, as we will learn now, their own proper central government that created this massive fortifications. But it's just like a world that you never see in its, again, entirety, right? And if so, for smaller centers, like, again, Orvieto or San Gimignano, etc. Now, the important thing, first of all, to me as a military historian, specializing, by the way, exactly at this time and in the Holy Roman Empire, seeing really a lot of Italian warfare, throughout, especially mostly exactly the end of the 13th, the early 14th century. The first thing that I am deeply impressed by, of course, it's not just the general forgetfulness about this literal fort of medieval Europe, demographically wise, and also the one with the highest per capita wealth concentrated in the entire globe, by the way. So a massive system. Right, and the fact that this is completely, again, outside of the more conventional historical references in medieval history and especially medieval warfare, right? And today I want to stress especially this part of the story, that is to say, the massive, not just extent of the Italian cities at the time, but their immense infrastructural defensive work that would count as, you would think, like of medieval castles in more feudal countries like England, France, Castile, that are, of course, there very neatly outlined, preserved. Like there was never a moment, even when castles sort of were outdated in a strategic sense, like they didn't demolish them in the middle of the countryside. With cities, because the Italians fundamentally had castles on their own all around, but most of their fortification process occurred in the cities, these settlements brought to the elimination of the structures that were at some point obsolete. They were not functional for the later, especially modern defense, and that also were further, modernized during the 19th century, like other centers of Europe that began to literally raise their own. Think about Paris, right? Even just in a peaceful sense. At some point, it was all a different urbanistic plan for these cities. And from a strictly military point of view, this is extremely important because for an age marked so intensely by siege warfare and the degree of warlikeness historiographically recognized for the Italian peninsula, the insane amount of wealth poured directly into war between the city-states with armies of tens of thousands that in this peak of medieval civilization were actually defying the notion that armies were smaller in the Middle Ages compared to what people think having actually been the usual army, for example, in ancient history, even especially in early modern history. Well, just look at 13th, 14th century Italy, and we will talk about that again, which is mirrored at a fortificatory level by these protections. This is what is incredibly important to understand in general about poliorcetics and the art of war during the Middle Ages, that the increase of fortification is not at all the symptom of a defensivistic approach, right? These fortifications were built, obviously enough, in the moment in which armies were the most offensive and capable of storming entire cities. So these structures that today we can just mostly see in their remains, traits of these walls, or in their beauty, however, only in an artistic depiction on illuminated manuscripts, are worthy of a great celebration of the same level of, say, early imperial Roman military engineering, to a degree that was recognized in those very years, which were starting to compare actually the size, also just the power involved in constructions from Roman times to the ones that were erected on their own, for example, for siege warfare, literally counter cities, just to encircle the cities all around. Something that, again, I've never seen a movie even conceiving. Even though this was the most habitual military practice routinely performed by all these city-states fighting against one another, and this is probably something that has not been studied for other countries as well, right? It is true, again, that other countries, in fact, did not have this level of endemic or wealth concentration. They were not as urbanized. They had sort of more sparse infrastructure, so it's kind of obvious. We see other, again, as we were saying before, masterpieces of military engineering as single castles, cornerstones, mostly strategically located by sort of bigger realms mostly. That's why, in fact, the more east and north we go, we see less in terms of at least bigger fortifications, but something at least more like would have been the average. But we're talking just places like Britain or Germany, because again, if you look at Northern Europe or Eastern Europe, it's they wouldn't remain, right? I can't stress enough how many castles there actually were everywhere in Europe at the time. Like for a few hundreds of square kilometers, there were hundreds of fortifications of sort. And again, for the Italian city walls, there should be a much greater space just in military historical disclosure and popularization. This video again is just on the city walls, so I refrained also in the images here to post, for example, about castles, other fortifications around. The same goes for house towers. I didn't insert those, even though they were sort of part of the same, because of course, as a broader strategic entity, that helped a great deal defending the cities. In fact, as we've seen also in other videos, very often the cities were attacked, right? There were not just like full sieges. They were objectively rare because, again, these were massive cities. We will see the size now. So just the bigger ones against the smaller ones, sort of in size, could attempt something like that. But it rarely got down to actual storming because it was easier to simply solicit a faction within. This is really normal in medieval times, to open the gates or something. There were furious battles inside, especially in the main square when it was reached by the intruders. At Semila, there were lots of urban battles. That's also something that we never sort of talk about. Do you know what was the biggest battle, right? The biggest urban battle in medieval times? This was the Battle of Rome in 1312. How many movies or series, whatever, have you ever even just heard about the home fact of Henry VII of Luxembourg to Italy between 1011 and 1313? That is literally the biggest military scenario that you can think of throughout the entire era, but somehow nobody ever even, decided this was something worth of a historical or popular ideation for cinema or whatever. This is insulting to actual, European identity, to just military history as a whole. And it also tells you how poorly done siege and urban warfare studies really are today. That's something I always say, not just because I carried out a bit of them myself, but because these are studies that require an enormous patience. There were hundreds, thousands of this in just a couple of generations, depending where you look at in Europe. And And yet, of course, like who's the crazy person that takes his time to collect like the entire samples, like for an entire region, even just so, and analyzing it entirely, and just discovering the like comparatively and also diachronically in part how these battles were actually waged. Well, probably just me at this point, because I've never found any study actually doing this on a regular basis. Like the best I've seen in military history for Middle Ages, at least, is, and probably also for the rest of the years, is just citing some of the most important examples across, I don't know, hundreds of years and generalizing about how things work, right? That's not how, in my opinion, a true academic work on these topics should be carried out, and nor like what true historical standards should abide by. In any case, I would like to briefly start just with the size of these cities before getting into the technicalities. So this is the amount of inhabitants of the major Italian city-states around 1300. So the peak of medieval civilization, the moment of greatest expansion that Europe wouldn't reach until like the end of the 17th century again. These are conservative estimates, right? I have other sources that say otherwise and more, right? We can't fully know, actually, like, because mostly we have either chronicles saying that, or maybe there are some estimates from the same communal offices of the time, but it's complicated for a number of reasons that I can't simply list. But here, scholarship tells us that this was the minimum that we can be sure of, right, in terms of size. So Milan, 100 to 150,000 inhabitants by 1288. They could have been 200,000, just for saying what we're talking about here. Consider that medieval cities were much more crowded than the Roman ones, right? There were as many inhabitants in the city and its suburbs than in the relative district, right? Which is insane. Like half of people living in the city in a way or another, and half in the countryside. This gives you an idea also how wealthy these centers were, obviously enough. Venice, again, conservative estimates, 100 to 120,000. Florence, 100 to 110,000 in 1338, which is not even the peak of the city's power. Siena, 52,000 between 1318 and 1320. Genoa, from 50 to 80,000. Bologna, 50,000 in 1294. Palermo, here we're not talking just about the, say, central northern Italian communes of the Italic Kingdom, the Papal States, just comparatively. So Palermo was essentially the capital of Aragonese Sicily after the Vespers, and it gives you we know more than 45,000 inhabitants, but you understand that for being the capital of a viceroyal, it does not compare to already like the great civilization of central and northern Italian cities. Even Rome, that everybody says, oh my god, Rome was so small, whatever, from 40 to 80,000 inhabitants. Consider that a very few other cities in Europe could boast this, and most of them were capitals of kingdoms or something, right? Pisa, 40,000 towards this, again, year 1300. Again, very conservative estimates, to be fair. Cremona, 40,000. Verona, Naples, Messina, from 35 to 40,000. Padua, 27, 30,000 at the end of the 13th century. 45,000 around 1320. Which also tells you how fast they were rising exactly in this point, how much they could peak. So these the sources from which these numbers are derived are very heterogeneous from one another, meaning that this is just a scholar that put together these lists without actually comparing the original sources and having like a sort of sensitive idea of how big these respective powers really were. Right. This is why I hate socioeconomical studies, because they do not understand literally anything about political and military history, but they have to throw random numbers to try to act as if they were making a statistics. But let's be honest, the socioeconomical bias is just for the mentally feeble. Now, Perugia, 27,000 in 1285, Brescia from 20 to 40,000, Pavia, Mantua, L'Aquila, Piacenza, Parma from 20 to 30,000, Lucca from 20 to 25,000. Some of these are correct. It depends. Again, the cities did vary in size, weren't all alike, as you understand. Like the first ones we listed were also, in fact, sort of the most developed powers. And in any case, you know that I made lots of videos about many Italian communes already as an introduction to the single cities for the regional historical series, which is a bit different from the other sort of more thematic videos, in which we'll surely discuss, especially now, and introduce something in the cycle for filling an unforgivable gap, that is the lack of mostly like Italian seigneurial history, like from, say, the age of the condottieri and stuff, that for some reason it's difficult to put together, because again, it's always the history of so many different centers at a time. So if you don't make some extra research on your own, you can't even quite find the right uniform comparable information. In any case, we have to explain how these walls had started expanding, and I will do it in a very simple, superficial way. Then we will make lots of videos explaining exactly how this went down. Now, the gradual expansion of city walls is, first of all, a notable illustration of urban development itself. Exactly because, as we were saying before, we do not exactly know how many people actually lived at a given time in the city. So archaeologically wise, knowing that, especially the medieval city walls, because often the ancient ones, as we will see now, were at times like bigger than needed for especially the early Middle Ages, does tell us how expansive at least this center was. During the early communal era, all cities, this is very important, all cities were fortified with walls that often represented, however, the remnants of the Roman fortifications from the late empire erected in the 3rd century to defend against early incursions by barbarian groups aiming to enclose the urban area established up to that time. This is an incredibly important dynamic. I don't need to digress once again on what kind of glue kept the Italian city-states together as such, how the communes were born. It suffices to say that these were conceived like in the full wake of the traditional Romano-Germanic civic and military identity as a body of citizens in arms that for this reason were considered to be noblemen, right? These people were free, that they were not considered like in other countries like somebody else's people ruled by this prince or this other. These citizens, especially living in the heart of the city, had always experienced uninterruptedly since Roman times the sense that their own municipality was essentially better than others. There is this term in Italian which is campanilistic, which refers to the bell towers of each city that would allegedly like sum up like the sort of localistic feeling towards of devotion towards your own city, that for which you hate the others and fight in this way. And the origin is incredibly old. Again, we were talking this just yesterday when discussing late antiquity. We have the idea that at some point the Western Roman Empire fell, and so the barbarians came and everything was down and lame. This is not what happened, and especially in Southern Europe, urban, and especially even more in Italy, of all the other countries, the urban and political continuity of the local communities and autonomies went on uninterrupted. Some centers, of course, declined, but we're talking mostly the smaller ones, the true Roman cornerstones that would, in fact, be functioning like the see of duchies and counties since the Lombard era, but the bishopric as well since early Christian times were soundly grafted on this cornerstone, this center that the Roman civitas had been, right? And this is why it's crucial to understand that these were cities and not towns, right? In some medieval history book, you still find this notion that, it doesn't matter, like, essentially what these communities really were. Like, the oblivion towards the sense that these were unique polities in Europe is often skipped when people compare mostly the size of the cities and call the smaller ones towns as opposed to city. The difference is radical instead. Like, the civitas is truly the sense that this is a sort of universe within its own. There are very specific boundaries that are framed into also public hierarchy, in this case even more in the Italic kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire, and that are not newly born towns that are fundamentally subjected to this or that lord that has created them as a sort of personal possession. If anything, the commune proper, as it's born within the city, it's still a chivalric knightly creation. It's actually a military regime with the consuls, in the early age, made lots of videos about this. That, however, is based on the notion that this is a community of freemen at large that coalesced to defend their own political prerogative as a city, right? And especially in the 13th century, starting from the beginning of the 13th century, we can talk of city-states as well, because essentially the commune by that point has reached this sort of overarching capacity. Like, it's a unique body, composed, of course, of other councils, etc., but fundamentally acts as a single juridical identity, right? There is a single statal identification of the community within the arms of the city, the army, and it's all alike in all these essentially 30 independent city-states. This has nothing to do, for example, we've seen it recently with Brugge, Bruges, with other important centers in medieval Europe, thriving commercial towns. Think about the Hanse, think about Flanders. There are, of course, the massive capitals, like, again, Paris, also London is a very old one since Anglo-Saxon times in its centrality. But essentially, like, also the Flemish ones that are basically the most important after the Italians altogether, also in this communalism. Some of the Flemish communes are actually older as an institution than the Italian ones. This is interesting, but they do not have the same level of development, especially at just a cluster of guilds that are more or less actively engaging with each one with other powers around. There is still a count of Flanders that truly lives there and that rules the land, and mostly these are bourgeois, right? The Italian city-states that rules itself by itself, goes at war and wins against the Holy Roman Emperor, and it is run by a military class of knights on its own that identifies with a city-state that is also of this scale of literal size. The cities are enormous compared to the other ones, and that has this enormous concentration of wealth and armies that can reach, in the case of Florence and Milan, to 30,000 men, that is the same size the King of France can have, are self-evidently something else, right? And that's why you have this hell of fortifications. The first element, as you've seen here, are the Roman remains, right? Fortifications that had always been kept up during the centuries. Italy had started to fortify itself, especially during the 3rd century crisis, mostly because of the wars between the same Romans. Italy was fortified from quite a while, but indeed there is the sense that in the later Roman Empire, you have to be a bit more watchful. Especially northern Italy acquires an ever greater strategic relevance also in the early Middle Ages, and so you need this broader reinforcement of the fortifications. I will make also a video speaking of the royal fortifications of Italy, because, as you know, the country from the 6th, or even before, depending on whether we want to look at the Ostrogoths, the Byzantine, the Longobards, I mean, in this case, for the Italic rule is autonomously run up to the 10th century, fundamentally. And as such, it does actually have relatively centralized system of defense that mostly revolve around the Alpine arc, because the kingdom fundamentally was centered in the Po Valley. And so you have this, but this existed since the Roman times. They were literally like same part of the Roman limes, also within the same provinces, and they kept being used, and the same communes actually inherited them later on, even though in that case as individual centers on their own. Also it's a bit more complicated because many of them did not even technically control the Alps, because they were sort of more peripheral areas, and say Milan, Florence, I don't know, Milan was close to the Alps even, but did not literally control them up to a certain point. They didn't need that. They needed much better, also considering that there are all these say troublesome neighbors all around, even more than the Hohenstaufen or whoever would launch a regional scale expedition into the peninsula that could create, in fact, problems. All right, so you have, again, in parallel with the kind of military activity of these centers, a continuous maintenance of the city walls. Now, if we look at the Roman ones, needless to say, these had been massive structures. These walls frequently encompassed vast areas reaching hundreds of hectares in larger cities. The most obvious example is Rome, right? It was just slightly smaller in hectares compared to Constantinople, but mostly the size was the same. Consider that Rome, well, until the 11th century, was essentially the largest city in Western Europe. So for all those who also think, oh my God, Rome decayed. Rome hardly ever decayed from any standpoint. That way, mostly Western Europe was civilized through Rome during the early Middle Ages by macroscopically obvious religious and cultural reasons. But aside from that, the Urbs, with her walls constructed, as you know, by the Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century, that you can still beautifully admire in the city, with all the medieval additions, right, if you have a bit of an archaeological eye, remains, however, a distinctive case. I mean, only Rome had this kind of defenses also remaining intact, essentially, across the centuries, covering 1,500 hectares. Comparatively, for example, Milan enclosed only 200 hectares. Right, and we're talking the Roman, the ancient ring, while Bologna likely established a more limited perimeter of just 25 hectares between the 3rd and the 4th centuries. It's not even to say that there were small cities, right? Also Milan, here it's sort of oversized because the actual center just for Rome during the Middle Ages was smaller, right? At least the early Middle Ages. And in the case of Rome, Rome remained always confined within the Aurelian walls. Instead, Milan far expanded them, beyond them, I mean. And the trend of smaller enclosures became more prevalent in the 10th century, amid renewed invasions by groups such as the Hungarians and the Saracens, and rising internal insecurity, prompting the construction of more compact and defensible walls around inhabited districts. Pavia went destroyed during the Magyar raids, and this was incomparably one of the single greatest tragedies in the history of mankind. I mean, there are countries today that are less important than what the archives of Pavia were, and unfortunately they went destroyed during these raids. And part of the issue was actually also Berengar of Friuli that, manipulated Magyars and other kind of things, but we will talk about that in other videos. In any case, this is the center of encastellation, and as we've seen in other videos, encastellation actually started from the Italian peninsula. I mean, in interest of time, the first, say, true foundation of a systematically structured stone fortification of the land, of the countryside, of the cities, began in central Italy, roughly in the 10th century, and then it reached essentially northeast Germany by the beginning of the 12th, right? And this, for obvious reasons, with the aforementioned material wealth, this greater availability, also prior infrastructure that could serve this purpose. Think about how many fortresses were reused, but how sort of big they could be for simply anyone, or to simply take them over, like having the resources to upkeep them. Consequently, in times like the 9th to 10th century, still the areas protected by these fortifications were significantly small, like with only Pavia, the capital of the Italian Kingdom, surpassing 50 hectares. It was a big deal. Today we will not explain what was also like the broader urbanistic purpose of these extensions, how the inner space was organized, the wide areas that were needed, for example, to gather the army, to train them, like to have a market space, chattel, it's a broader activities in some, also for sanitary purpose in some areas of the city. So that's all a complex thing. We will see in other videos about medieval urbanistics and archaeology that are, of course, very interesting topics indeed. Pavia, that we already mentioned so much here, was among the few cities recognizing the necessity to expand her walls beginning in the 11th century, increasing the area to 100 hectares. This is very interesting because Pavia would be a medium-sized city by communal times, but it was also, of course, requiring important defenses. It was actually one of the, I think it was the last of the larger Lombard centers to give way to Milan, right? That was it was sort of very early aggressive, right? Taking over places like Lodi, Crema, Monza, etc. Pavia held out up to the 30s or the 50s of the 14th century, even though it had already fallen, of course, in the sphere of influence of Milan. But much of this had also to do with its fortifications. In fact, we have more, say, not really anonymous cities, but, say, centers that we may even know better about the fortifications of than some more active powers out there. In Rome, Pope Leo IV, 847-855, fortified the 75 hectares of the Leonine city to safeguard the Vatican from renewed Saracen threats that had been a great problem, as you know, in Carolingian times. Like, the Muslims went as far as looting the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul. So the Leonine city that you can part still see is really a fruit of this essentially late Carolingian fortificatory needs against the early second invasions. Most other substantial cities during this period remained confined to areas ranging from 20 to 45 hectares, and it's worth noting that some population centers were already established outside the walls, near large suburban monasteries. And this is the main dynamic of the time. You have the citizens, as we were saying before, that live properly within the city gates, right, and really have a great relevance and importance. Then you have this people, mostly peasants, living in the suburbs that do not really have a city rights, but they come into the city in the day to work and then going to sleep home at night outside the city walls in the suburbs, that are so relevant for the city growth and production and power. These were all in many ways organized as manpower, labor force. And these suburbs are actually the main reason why the city gates extend, right, to really literally defend this populace that on the longer run will become citizenry as well. This is also how the city's population grows, and it grows a big deal this time. As population growth occurred, suburbs began to emerge further around these early habitation centers. Historical accounts suggest these developments were underway by the late 11th century and rapidly evolved in the following one, which of course goes in perfect parallel. You see how there are no coincidences in history with the foundation of the communal regime, right? Of course, who was actually building the walls, if not a proper government? And what kind of government is, making the big leap forward here? Of course, the communes. Initially, these settlements, we're talking the suburbs here, were somewhat protected by a trench and a palisade, right? As most centers in Europe as a whole really were, right? And this, in Italian, in Latin, was often termed a circa or circla. So, as you know, the circa meaning around, and so circle too. Hence, the Italianate expression. The circla had entrances secured by stone gates and flanked by walls extending several dozen meters. This basic enclosure allowed for some regulation of entry and exit, facilitating toll collection on goods passing through, because the commune would control, of course, the suburbs as well, together with the surrounding countryside. For instance, such circular fortifications successfully repelled initial imperial attacks during the siege of Milan in 1162 by Frederick Barbarossa. So they were relevant fortifications. They were pretty large, big, and if properly manned, they could keep powerful enemies out. Just again, the other day I made a video about medieval siege warfare, so we insisted on the point of how it's not just like there are stone walls of castles or cities. There is, of course, around a lot of different layers of defense that can be probably organized. Of course, Milan had massive defenses, and what you understand here is that even when, for example, like a full, say, stone ring, for example, hadn't been established or finished, because there were some parts that had crumbled historically, like even from Roman times, had not been refilled. At times, it was also convenient to simply stiffen that with, I don't know, a ditch, a palisade. You didn't need necessarily to build an entire part of the wall. There were some, as we'll see now, some walls that took generations being built, so they evidently weren't, they were thinking on the long term. We'll see now how, just like the big cathedrals, etc., as construction sites, also for broader political and economical reasons. But they were still something. I mean, if one part, of course, they would try to, of course, think strategically there, they would have started from the side of the city that they thought was more exposed, where the enemy would have more likely attacked, etc., and continuing this, considering that there were already inner rings, and so that you could construct this incredibly articulated and complex system of defenses that even the most organized of the enemies would have, of course, difficulties in penetrating. Again, everything is moral in nature. It's not just simply by building walls that you defend them, but of course, if you look at the military of these communes, you realize that everything was incredibly sophisticated. We will surely talk about how, for example, even some strongholds in the countryside were properly manned, supplied, armed, and so on. Like it's incredibly important. In Bologna, around the mid-13th century, a circla was constructed extending 8 kilometers to encompass a larger area, increasing the city's territory to 417 hectares. Eventually, the circla was supplanted in the Italian communes by new stone bastions, often built quickly in response to the campaigns of Frederick I that definitely hammered those Lombards, or the intensifying clashes between cities that on the longer run, in fact, would like the most compact and developed fortifications. These construction projects demanded substantial technical and financial resources, which deterred, for example, many city councils, especially once the state of emergency had passed. This is really typical of the era. If you look, for example, at the second invasion, say the Vikings, the Magyars, the Saracens, etc., you realize that actually all this great deal of encapsulation did not really happen during that period proper, but only when the major invasions had passed, and that we do not really have many, at least remains, of those fortifications were indeed erected when these attacks came, because they weren't as frequent as the ones of the local powers that also played much more sort of at home. And generally speaking, as we were just saying, even for these Italian communes, like the most strategic, the most effective policy was to fortify the more sensible centers, especially those that were the biggest, who could accumulate a larger surplus, from which, in fact, powers could dominate on the surrounding countryside. These fortifications do not have a merely sort of tactical purpose, for which, of course, you have to defend with them, but you can basically accumulate resources, manpower in them to eventually launch better organized attacks on the neighbors. This is particularly pronounced among the Italian communes, but the point I was making is that the permanence of fortifications is not much due, and this is important to stress how Europe sort of was booming at this point, that it's not like we much needed to build fortifications because of external invaders, but because we began to be incredibly wealthier, probably from the European hinterland, and expanding from that. That's the peak of encapsulation. The structures we would erect for the Vikings or the Saracens, the Magyars, were just temporary, one way or another, and or fixed in places where these guys came from far away. So it could be just, mountain passes, forests that were not the places that you really needed to guard otherwise all the time, because actually the greatest strategic forces were in the lowlands, right? And again, the Italian communes are a good example because they have normally districts of hundreds of square kilometers, so they're not immense territorially, but they are immense in terms of local power. And so I don't know if you are, of course, if you are a pre-alpine commune, or at least you control the alpine valleys from there, you will fortify those places. But they're never going to be as well fortified as the actual city, right? Because the purpose is that, the enemy can even break through, but the alpine passes, think about, Frederick Barbarossa with the locks of Verona on the Adige, the Etsch River, that oblige him to pass elsewhere. The same goes for other cities like Brescia, like Bergamo, the same Milan, and more, so in Piedmont. The same goes for the Apennines, etc. But the sense is that if the city holds, the enemy that comes routinely around still has to come back where he's originally from, especially with the Germanic expeditions in the peninsula. And so at that point, you can simply retake control whatever you have lost on this periphery. As long as the city is robust, it can continue its own struggle. Consider that Frederick Barbarossa famously razed Milan to the ground, or at least razed its walls. The Milanese rebuilt everything from scratch, and they eventually won the war. So this gives you an idea of the shockingly overwhelming amount of wealth and power that these communities really have. It's utterly insane and unmatched in the rest of the continent, or in the world for that matter. So around the year 1300, that, as we've seen, is really the apotheosis of the Italian communes. There was a lot of war as a consequence as well, right? So it's not much the insecurity that exists, but the continuous warfare, just the continuously aggressive policies of a commune against one another, so that the stone walls, even weren't enough alone. Like the multiple rings were needed. This had already began from a while, but at this point you have the demographic peak, right? The rapid growth of the population for which the original ring is not enough anymore. Even the one already built beyond the ancient one in this previous generations. A financial assessment in Perugia, we made a video, by the way, about public debt in the Italian communes, mostly revolving around the military. This is known as the Libra, so that indicated more or less the costs, the pros and the cons. Indicated that by 1285, the number of households located outside the city walls was at least equal to those within them. Occasionally, military threats still necessitated fortifications, exemplified by the trench constructed in 1323 to safeguard the suburbs of Milan, that already had like pretty strong fortifications. Nevertheless, we're looking, in this case, a city that could be barely threatened by anyone. I mean, who would besiege Milan? Literally, 200,000 inhabitants. Like, how do you even encircle that? Right? There are actually means to do so. For example, Florence is besieged by Henry VII, but it's basically a complete fiasco because he cannot surround it. And so, literally, all the Florentine allies replenish the city that in 1312 resists. The emperor has to simply go away without having even tried just to break. Or at least they tried to break through, but the defenses, and at that point, the outer, at least the newer outer walls were not completed yet, but the ditches, palisades were enough, right? So there is all a technicality here. Milan, for example, is threatened at different times. Recently, it had been the object of a crusade from the side of the Cardinal Legate Bertrand de Pouget, that was just encamped in Monza, so a few tens of kilometers away. It's basically like it's just next door. They could see each other. I made a video about the crusade against the Visconti. We'll come back on that. That siege alone had cost the coffers of Pope John the 22nd 1,300,000 florins. Right, there were some cities that could be bought for several tens of thousands of florins. Do you realize the cost? Like, we're attacking Milan in that case. Over 1 million florins. These are mass, like the siege of Zara, for example, by the Venetians, around a bit later, like in 40s of the 14th century, cost 1 million florins. We're talking astronomical ciphers that, in fact, the Italians normally lent also to the English, to the French monarchs to make war against one another. Like the 100 Years' War had also to do part with these things. So, nevertheless, during this period, what we see, if anything, that there's an actual expansion of the city, walls, all outer stone rings, but they do not occur with the same anxiety, for example, that had characterized the era of Frederick I, where there were large enough armies that could simply threaten an entire city on a regular basis. This is actually the moment in which many Italian cities are conquered by the bigger ones, but normally this happens through a coup, right? Through an intrusion, some sort of political deals, right? And not much with the siege of an entire city. It still did happen, though. Especially from the 20s of the 14th century, though, the 14th century crisis is sort of kicking in. And so many of the cities are indebted to the point they couldn't, of course, finance such enormous infrastructures, except for cities, again, like, for example, Florence. Florence was literally the richest city in the world at the time, and so they could afford, if anything. Also, as you know, an enormity of buildings. I have more videos incoming on exactly 14th century Florence, so we'll look at that. But the smaller, medium-sized cities, they had built a couple of rings, but now they couldn't do much. They could just, at this point, defend and mostly give way actually to greater powers that would fundamentally control them and just require not even soldiers but money for paying their own mercenaries. So that's also a bit how the era of the condottieri starts, and I made multiple videos on this. The building of walls occurred thus at a more leisurely pace. Often, for example, in Florence, again, this took place from 1248 to 1333, while in Bologna it spanned from 1250 to 1370. It's not like there weren't big deals occurring at this time. I just mentioned before how, in fact, the Florentine walls were in theory when Henry VII besieged the city. Bologna also had lots of issues, also some regime change, etc. These, if anything, are cities that remain fundamentally independent. However, they have their own gradual encapsulation and fortification within the city gates by more seigneurial regimes. Bologna, at least, will be eventually ruled by the Pope. So there is a tendency, if anything, to fortify the city from the within, which is also another aspect that is especially characteristic of the later Middle Ages, and we do not see, let's say, from the outer side. This is the peak of exterior fortification, proper enlargement of the cities. Then, after this, you have an enormous fortification within the city. It becomes ever more robust, actually more important in the general political landscape, as you know. We discussed this at length in other videos about late medieval government and territorial control. But they are not expanding from the within anymore from an extensional point of view. They're just further enrocking and entrenching. There were instances when communal authorities contemplated grand plans seeking to anticipate the long-term repercussions of population growth, so thinking sort of in advance, strategically, leading to significant expansions of urban areas from 97 to 430 hectares in Florence, and from 120 to 417 hectares in Bologna, as we were illustrating just right now. Because, of course, as we've seen, they were long-term infrastructural works that mostly had lots of workers coming to live in the cities during the generations, and the cities were still essentially expanding in the process, so everything would do. Like, that's how cathedrals were built in medieval Europe. We began to build them exactly more or less around the 12th, 13th centuries, and eventually exceeding the 13th and 14th until, in fact, the crisis arrived, and we had to finish belfries, bell towers in the 19th century, right? So that's very telling about like the brusque contraction that especially the 14th century crisis brought. In fact, this demographic decline follows, culminating in the arrival of the plague. Consequently, the bastions erected around 1300 often enclosed large vacant spaces, now more than sufficient to house the population for several centuries. And this is in fact this is valid for many areas in Europe, but naturally Italy, having this greater centrality of the city, of the urban space, urban culture, brings still to much of what you can see. This beautiful historical centers that do not really stop to the core, like the main square, right? They enclose often like the entire town, when these have remained towns, like by, say, industrial standards, right? And that look very medieval. In the 19th century, however, the Italian communal governments began demolishing these structures to convert them into avenues that still today outline the historical layout of the walls in many cities. In other words, you have this rings, not of walls, but of roads that circle around the old town, the historical center, and sometimes are properly also just in the inner city, meaning that eventually what is technically the center, even outside the historical center, is very center and beyond these rings, especially in the larger cities. I mean, think about Rome, right? The historical center is technically the one within the Aurelian walls, but the actual center extends towards like the more sort of contemporary rings of circumvallation. for traffic control, etc. This is, again, very peculiar because, as you know, this really molded even the modern ways of communication. In Rome, you cannot simply build subways like as you could build in another city for obvious reasons, and so there is a distinct shape, let's say, Italian historical centers, especially in this central northern sort of more, comparable and regulated system in medieval times, where these were very large urban centers, and consider that this is true in the general geography of the land. I mean, for example, Italy still has the highest demographic density by considering the population, almost 60 million, in at least a narrow land, or at least one that most of which in the hinterland is mountainous. And so this affected the urban development, say, in more recent times as in the medieval ones. Needless to say, what is fascinating, of course, that the Italian communes, that the commune is still the municipal government of the cities, right, in the Italian Republic. So they literally, the Italian communes exist since those times, like in other European cities, but with this sort of greater load of sort of autonomous tradition. And they had at some point to get rid of these older structures that in many cases were faticent, also because some parts were not properly modernized until pretty late. Think about, some parts of the Papal States. Even though, of course, when you look at the distribution of wealth in Italy, in Europe, you realize that great part of central and northern Italy is part, in fact, of the so-called blue banana that is exactly the greatest amount of industrialization of per capita wealth and so on. And this is exactly due to the fabric that this city was managed to mold around. Like the territory really revolves all around the city. This is a very specific medieval Italian characteristic. Like in France or in Germany, you have wide forested areas where some communities, for example, live fundamentally detached from urban centers. In Italy, you can argue that since Roman times, this is not a thing anymore in any other time. So there are lots of dynamics in this urban development that are part also of a broader national one. The two primary periods for wall construction, the late 12th and around 1300, provide thus this general orientation, but also sort of overview. In reality, throughout these times were various instances of wall expansions that occurred differently from commune to commune. For example, the Florentines had to address this issue 6 times between 1078 and 1330 due to significant population increases. Sometimes it wasn't even about adding an entire ring. It was the norm here, adding a couple really or more, which is what is not really happening elsewhere because of the sheer size of the city. But in some cases it was just like a more asymmetrical issue. Like we wanted to fortify just one suburb in one part of the city. The geography could be complex. You could just have different blocks like fortified at a time. Despite this, the two periods, again, the late 12th century and the late 13th, early 14th, one stand out for their dense concentration of such construction projects. Now, there are interesting studies. Some of you always ask me about sources, right? There is an interesting study by Garzella that is, she's an Italian scholar that made this very detailed research serving as a prime illustration of habitat expansion during the early communal period. And she did so for Piza, right? The road network suggests that the densely populated areas were limited to the old Roman center and the banks of the Arno, specifically the Kinzica district to the south. Nonetheless, churches can also be bound in the outskirts where urban development was on the rise. Right? Notably, the cathedral and episcopal see were located on the city's northwestern edge, adjacent to the city walls, which is a common trend in many other urban areas. The city wall, designed to encircle the entire inhabited area, was built between 1155 and 1161, with the Auser, this old coarse waterway, marking its northern boundary, right? And it's actually a very complex picture because you know that Pisa at some point was on the sea, right? So there are, at some point we rely just on chronicles. For example, the annals of Bernardo Marangone, that you have to intertwine with archaeological data. And so trying to pinpoint like properly on the territory, like the various construction phases and so on. There's, for example, another scholar named Redi that has mostly dealt with this. And so it's very interesting again because Pisa is also an important city at the time. It has, again, this portual dimension. It's a maritime republic, but it's also really the most important maritime republic to have an actual open hinterland. So they actually also involved themselves into the Tuscan internecine warfare that, as we've seen, was pretty brutal, to say the least. The peasants happily contributed to that. They were ferocious. And they had actually also a hell of an army, especially in the late 13th, early 14th century. So what we get from these researches is an original plan consisting of a ditch established in 1155 and a palisade in 1156. It's also interesting that this occurred at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, mostly sponsored Pisa, but the peasants were wary of potential problems, and they fortified a bit more. Thereafter, 5 consecutive years of construction efforts contributed to a segment of the wall, occasionally resuming work to achieve its final elevation. Then there are these sort of very unique circumstances. For example, Venice, a city built on water through extreme feats of engineering. This context differs significantly from that of other cities. There are other admirable things. I don't know, Siena, that literally exists on the top of a massive hill, and there is all well systems that still today, like contemporary researchers do not understand how it really works because it was so well built and encased, like in medieval times, so you can't simply go into it and study how it was done. To bring water in this otherwise sort of arid top, where you wouldn't have simple springs like emerging, so this is just one of the most shockingly impacting feats of medieval engineering that literally blow your mind, because not even with our contemporary means we can't understand how they actually made it. But in any case, Venice has a huge advantage, which, speaking of city walls, obviously will make you wonder. In fact, there are no walls in Venice, notoriously. There's also no ancient city layout, really, because Venice is born on these islets of the lagoon, and so there's no civitas, there's no prior Roman. There were, actually these islets were inhabited. It's a myth, really, that they were more inhabited, or at least that the city was founded just during the migration era of some sort. There had always been fishermen, whatever, but of course, as we know, during the High Middle Ages, this thing starts taking off in also one of the single most systematically ruthless and violent ways on all the neighbors, and takes over half of the Mediterranean. The Venetians have this incredibly fierce and crystal clear understanding of that political and strategic management through which they beat all their competitors. Now, the earliest neighborhoods in mostly on Rialto Island, because that's the thing, but also on the other islands developed. There were better shielded from water exposure, often positioned near monasteries and noble residences. So there is also a great ad hoc private development of all this. Over time, the population grew, though, linking these initial groups. But soon the available land became inadequate for new construction, and this led to efforts in reclaiming land from marshy areas and filling in shallow waterways that separated the islands, with only narrow channels left for navigation. Hence, you see, Venice. The ensuing road system was complemented by additional narrow lanes known as calli, from callus in Latin, which means narrow street path. The waters and wetlands were owned by the commune, which allocated them to those who promised to build on the land. This geography also informed such high level of organization in the Venetian government, because there were some sort of more imperative reasons that required such unity of command. This would be incredibly effective, again, from a political and strategical standpoint. A portion of this land was also reserved for monasteries, which began subdividing property in turn, which tells you how, again, motivated, even just how the space of the sacred. We'll talk more about monastic history, but in this regard, it's extremely fascinating to think of how this was to be like a city like any other, or even a better one, right? These plots, by the way, often took on an elongated form, oriented perpendicular to the canals. The parish network, which encompassed about 70 parishes, expanded alongside the growing population, with each island housing a church that marked its boundary with neighboring parishes following the lines of land reclamation. The parish divisions aligned with those of the Vicinia, that is the literal neighborhood, which held significant importance in Venice as in other Italian communes. The vicini, so the neighbors, those who share the same parish, managed the local waterway environment for the community's benefit, and frequently received laws for collective reclamation efforts as well. This is something similar to what you see, for example, in Northern Europe, the reclamation, say in countries like the Netherlands, it's a relentless work to strip land from water, right? At this point, to win over this force of nature. Like, this is tell how motivated all these communities were in this moment of greater expansion of European power. This in Venice contributed to the development of the city's most densely populated areas, especially alongside the Canal Grande, where the first bridge to Rialto was erected in 1175. Let's stress that Venice was a particularly young city, did not have a prior urban fabric, right? It had just been erected, and so consider this also in that moral projection. How much did this weigh in terms of entrepreneurship and, sense of control and power wielding? Civic life flourished between this bridge and St. Mark's Square, which were the two principal centers of initial urbanization. One focused on commerce and the other on governance, as it was the case for other communes that had, again, the market area, then the public square with the symbol of civil power, then the church, normally, or different churches, of course, especially in these cases. By the latter half of the 13th century, the Venetian communal initiatives for land reclamation and neighborhood construction rivaled the ambitious expansions seen in other cities. In 1329, the commune embarked on its most expensive and outward construction endeavor, known as the Giudecca Nuova. Though progress was interrupted by the plague, the foundational arrangements were made, leaving a regular grid pattern that remains visible in the island's layout. Right, I inserted, some aerial view of Venice here. So when you look at other realities, like big Rome, for example, right? The Roman development did not feature successive wall constructions, but it occurred consistently within the confines of the Iranian walls, because these were so huge that the medieval city never, of course, reached its boundaries, but it still managed to mend important parts of that to fortified other areas. All the bridges on the Tevere River were, for example, fortified, like these other cities normally. Starting in the 20s of the 13th century, urbanization in Rome began to spread amidst remnants of rural areas as well, because a lot of this enormous perimeter, again, of 1,500 hectares had remained also dedicated to cultivation, or even left like wilderness with animals and stuff. Instead, Rome began to now expand along, especially both sides of the Tiber's bend. Of course, it's the most concentrated part in Roman settlement, in a region that sustained a stable population primarily due to clusters of residences around churches as a form of local organization. We will see this better also when we will talk about the Roman communal militia. There was a thing. By approximately 1289, the area designated for new urban growth had expanded in Rome to 350 to 400 hectares, at which point this expansion ceased. And it was just like in other communes that had just outside the city walls, from the sector, the side of the sector where you live, like your own properties. This was very important even in a political and strategical sense, because depending on who inhabited were, there were naturally some factors considering, like for example, the direction of expansion in the district. Let's remember, this was all fortified. In fact, the commune never fully managed to control this district. There was always some private property of some powerful clansmen that were part of the city government and everything, but wouldn't in fact simply give up, even when they were ostracized, banned during the anti-magnate legislation, etc. Their own ancestral powers, and that were often backed by other powers, also other communes that wanted to use them as a bit of Trojan horse into the enemy district. There is always an incredible complexity in the general also expansion and fortification of these centers, because they are very, again, these are universes on their own. That's how they see themselves, but of course everything they do is in function to these other universes. It's like they're like more stars in a galaxy, rather, and the concentration, especially of, again, resources, demographics, etc., is really consistent, is really impacting. And generally speaking, we see, in fact, this in the if you walk the streets, if you stroll the streets of these towns. Again, here I used, I think, enough pictures to render the idea, but you have properly that sense of medievalness also in the narrowness, in the compactness, in the bulkiness, in the sort of long-term mentality for the city's protection. What is interesting, of course, in the history of these centers is how eventually, they would grow subordinated to the bigger ones, yet preserving always that central role in the local government, like in a decentralized fashion. If you look at, again, San Gimignano, Montepulciano, etc. If you look at the Florentine power, they tried not to oppress them more than much, even when they conquered them, even when they took them over, because at the end of the day, this power was not go anywhere. Right? This is not like a major landlord that can simply take over a province. Right? Once you have subdued the cities, they're going to stay there, and the more you stabilize them, the more destabilize your own territorial control. Naturally, just some big powers can do this. There are a handful, really, or a bit more if you count the smaller ones that remain independent at times up until the pretty late in time, like in the later modern era. But overall, we're talking about a general the consolidation of a statal form also at a territorial level. Hence, also a great deal of further fortification of different sites that were not cities. There were also rural communes at Similia, etc. However, they were not civitates, as we were distinguishing the terminology before. All right. So there is really a lot to cover about this. This video this is not strictly, as you understand, a military history video. This is just mostly showing, realizing how relevant in general such infrastructure was, how I'm checking some of the pictures here, how really how necessary it was for protecting the population in suburbs and to fundamentally control the surrounding territory as well, which is an underrated aspect of the wall. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.